This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. In our national program of talks tonight, we bring you a panel discussion entitled Withering Smiles. The panelists are Ms.Sapna Bhatia, leading education consultant, Ms. Mimamsa Singh Tanwar, well-known clinical psychologist, Mr. R. Srinivasan, co-founder and chief customer officer of one of Asia's leading education service providers, and Anandu Chakravarti, media personality who initiates and moderates this panel discussion.
There's no evening rush of feet in the corridors anymore. There's no thumping of the basketball in the elevator anymore. And it seems the 9 and the 11-year-old giggles have died a silent death. It seems as if childhood has taken leave of the world. We, their fathers and mothers and grandpas and grandmas, speak once in a while through hushed masks and in solemn tones. And then, when a grandma asks the grocer for a nice lolly or a chocolate bar, do we know that they're there, within the joy-bereft jails their homes have become? Friendless, schoolless, joyless, mischiefless, laughterless children of a pestilence. I wrote these lines when the second lockdown and the second wave happened. And we're here in the studios of All India Radio with the national program of talks Withering Smiles, wherein we'll talk about the stress our children have undergone during these last 2 years of COVID lockdowns and then, of course, coming out of it. What it means for the children, what it has meant for them, the stress that they've undergone, and what is the way forward. With me in the studio are the eminent panelists, Mimamsa Singh Tanwar, a renowned clinical psychologist, Sapna Bhatia, an education consultant, and of course R. Srinivasan, co-founder and CCO of one of Asia's leading education services providers. Welcome you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So my opening question is very simple, and I would like an opening remark from all of you. What do you think has it meant for our children and adolescents during these last 2 years? Mimamsa, let me open with you.
I think it's been for them about building resilience from day-to-day challenges that they've faced in their lives of uncertainty, unpreparedness, not knowing what to do with that unstructuredness that came into their lives. The fact that they could not meet their friends for a very long time. They could not connect with their teachers, with their peers. The sounds of the bells in the school that would make them remind that, now there is one class to the other, that they are going to move on, and in between chirping that would happen. All of that went amiss. And of course, there was this feeling of vacuum at some times, a feeling of loss at other times, and there would be hardships because it's not been an easy time for anyone for that matter. Yet I believe that children had shown a lot of resilience during this time period.
Thank you. Srinivasanji, your views on this?
Childhood is naturally a period for exploration, learning, and schools do play, apart from homes, a very important role in stimulating, not only from the teachers or faculty, from co-learners. A lot we learn outside the classroom and with co-learners. These 2 years, the impact is going to be devastating, to say the least, in the sense that they are confined to homes, but almost 80% of the households in the country have one-room homes and 4 to 5 children or family members. Electricity in this country, almost 48% of the households get 10 hours of electricity. And there are many which hardly get 2 hours of electricity. Then devices, because electronic children were using devices. Only 6% of the countryside population had devices. And at the urban, 27% had devices. When you say devices, I'm ruling out smartphones. Smartphone itself is pretty meager. The whole country has 27% only smartphones. And net connectivity. So all these things have really complicated, though as a nation, or most of educationists do believe that the nation has done really good. But 2 years of this disconnected and isolated is going to have severe devastation on quite a few fronts for this nation. Of course, the childhood has been lost in the isolation.
Sapna, I would come to you now. What do you think happened to the students of the so-called elite schools? Did they undergo any kind of hardship, disruption during the COVID times?
Yes, in fact, Mimamsa and Sri have made very valid points. And covered most of the ground. But let me tell you that even the students from the well-to-do schools went through a very harrowing time, especially the students who were in grade 12. And the batch of 2020 and 2021, when the pandemic came around, were completely unprepared for the way the carpet was literally yanked out from under their feet. So in the morning, I would be counseling parents who would be wondering, who would be thinking that what is going to happen vis-a-vis the admissions. And at night, it would be the students who would call me up and say that, where do we go from now? And so, of course, it was a very difficult time. And I mean, one thing that it did teach motivated students was that, how to think out of the box and still make the best of a bad situation. Apart from that, the younger students from these well-to-do families, as you say, went through the same trauma. I mean, not being with their friends is not something that is limited only to the underprivileged. Not being with your friends, not being able to build empathy or learn, how to communicate with your peers is equally devastating.
True, absolutely. So what we will do in the course of this program is what I call get to hear voices from the ground. And we have with us a clip from Ambuj, who is from Dwarka. Let's hear what Ambuj has to say about how he coped with COVID.
In the beginning, lockdown was fun and exciting. I had a lot of time to enjoy online games, sleep, watch movies. I did not require to worry about school, homework as well, and exams. It was like a dream come true. But eventually, as days passed, lockdown became boring. And the saddest part was that I could not meet my friends, cracking jokes between the classes. In the lockdown, all I had was to just sit at home, stuck between four walls with no one to play with or talk to.
Here is Dwayne Mendonza from Goa, a student of class 8.
Initially, I liked online classes because I did not have to get up and go to school. I also did not have to travel all the way to school and back. My teachers had prepared videos and notes on the chapters we had to learn. I could watch them whenever I wanted to. But after some time, I began to get bored. My eyes used to pain from copying the notes given in the PDF. Every day began to feel the same. I missed meeting my friends, teachers, and playing on the big ground. I am happy to go to school once again.
Stuck between the four walls. As grown-up adults, as parents, in various stratas of life, we all know what we've gone through. The total disconnect with the outside physical world. Mimansa, I would like to ask you this. What would it mean for a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old to be physically disconnected with your friends? What has it meant? Have you experienced any personal problems that, kids would have approached you with or parents would have approached you with?
Well, I believe that this time period only magnified for the adolescent particularly to be more on social media. And the disconnection in any case, even prior to the pandemic, was there because of the kind of communication patterns which has been happening, more indirect because of the social media intrusiveness in our lives. And of course, it has its own positives. And we saw the positive during the pandemic. I mean, if we did not have the digital connect, we wouldn't have been connected to anyone. Yet, I think the key lies in giving adolescent two things. One is that it severely impaired and impacted their relationship during this time period. Because of this indirect communication, lack of initiation, not having physical proximity, young people begin to think, in the aspect of, is he still connected? Am I still a part of that group? In that WhatsApp group message or any other networking site you look at, if there is a comment which was missed by one person, a friend, the other person begins to feel immediately, oh, my comment was missed. So am I no longer an active, engaged part of that person, of that group? Or for that matter, for some children, yes, they can have those, group interactions. For some, it is difficult because they find it more easy to have one-to-one conversations. They are able to relate to their friends much better in that sense. So of course it brought in a lot of insecurities, a lot of anxieties for the young generation, and which is why two things, like I said, are very important. One is we need to really talk about healthy relationship building, and which involves an effective communication, which I think has certainly been getting impaired more and more now. And the second aspect is media literacy, because yes, during this time period, a lot of youngsters were on media, different social networking sites, doing different things. So both the things I think play a very important role.
Let's hear from another student, Nakul, and let's see what he has to say. Nakul is also from a school in Delhi.
My name is Nakul Arora. I am in 8th class now. In March, due to COVID cases rising, I had to stay at home. In April, I got to know that my classes will be online. I was very excited as I prepared for online classes by setting up the camera, laptop, and the Wi-Fi. All interaction with the teachers and students was online. We had to give our examinations online. I did finally pass the 6th standard without even a single day of going to school. After spending a year online, in 7th, the threats of new waves. Again, a year went by with the same routine. In a nutshell, I can say physical connect is no match to online connect.
So there is that silver lining, and this child seemed very happy that is going back to school. Some of the things that she was saying, and I want to bring this up. How effective has online learning been?
Continuing what I said earlier, not more than 10 to 15% of children in this country have had access to the classrooms through the mediums that we fostered during this period. Having been involved in this kind of technology-enabled education for the last 20 odd years, and these technologies have been available for the last 20 years, the really good technology-enabled faculty have been able to bring in quite a few features which children never ever experienced before. So they had animations, films, a lot of stuff that could have been part of the classrooms the last 20 years. Suddenly they came into the classroom. And the experiences have been, those who had the access and those who were in the classrooms, though they missed their friends and so on and so forth, but they had a very rich learning experience in terms of the interfaces that they experience.
Let me stop you there. I can understand, yes, schools prepared, they learned to teaching through PowerPoint, and maybe some of them even did small animations to, disseminate and the lessons that they were teaching. However, I think the difference is using a digital medium in a classroom, you're still interacting with your friends and cracking that odd joke and pulling the teacher's leg, vis-a-vis this cold environment of sitting in front of a screen was different, no?
Yes, I completely agree with you, because from my time as a teacher, I remember, getting a student to pay attention in a structured environment is difficult enough. And when he is not physically in the classroom, it is very easy, despite the fact that you have technology to enable new ideas. But, the motivation that a child gets when he makes eye contact with the teacher and the teacher says, yeah, you've done well. Or when he comes back and says, ma'am, can I, give you a different interpretation of this? So that motivation factor, I feel, was missing. Though I do agree with what you are saying. The motivated ones did make an effort. But for a very large, like my next door neighbor, she would tell me that her son gets up in the morning and switches on the camera. As far as attendance is concerned, then they all switch off their cameras and the class proceeds in inverted commas. And at the end of the day,
in absentia.
Yeah, absolutely. Many a time he actually falls off to sleep.
Yeah.
So that has been a challenge. And while I do not disagree with Sri that, it has taught them to make the class, interactions more interesting. But I think we have a long way to go before we finally get there.
Unless it becomes a little bit of a boy speak. We've had two boys and we've heard them. Let's hear a girl for a change, Angana from Delhi.
Hi, I am Angana Devan. In the beginning of the lockdown, every kid was somehow happy about it because they did not have to worry about getting up at 6 in the morning, worry much about school. But as time passed, it also started to get very boring and unhealthy. It was more of mental stress than physical, but somehow we passed that stage too. And now that schools are reopening, it is a bit hard to adjust and get used to all of those things again. But at the same time, I honestly feel really good.
Yes, and we've been talking about this. Now that, of course, some students who went through their senior secondary or went through class 9 and 10 without having to attend school, I think they will remain a deprived forever lot. However, there is, of course, people like Angana who are back to school and happy that they're back to school. But my question is, do you think, Mimamsa, the impact of these 2 years of social disconnect will just go in a jiffy once they're back to school, or do you think it'll linger?
Anything which requires transition and adaptation takes time. Neither do we adapt in a jiffy, nor can we readapt in a jiffy. So, of course, children are going to take their own time to adapt back to this. For some kids, it is going to be easy. For some, it's going to be harder. And it will also be based upon the kind of experiences they've had in their own individual spaces. Within the families, they've gone through some trauma, grief, or loss. Or did they have a conducive environment enough that things were largely okay? So for every child, the experience is going to be different. The impact is going to be different. So even though we all may be sailing at the same time, but we had our own ups and downs, and that's true for children as well. And that's what we need to look at when we look at readjustment and readaptation. That schools at this point in time are doing their best to really welcome students back with a sense of hope and joy, because I think even schools and teachers have been waiting to connect back with peers and students for that matter. The only thing that we all have to look at is how can we provide the right kind of support in the form of psychological first aid to any child who would have gone through something difficult and is now going to show a representation of that in their behavior without us knowing what really happened. And as teachers, we need to be just a bit more prepared and aware of the fact that a lot of these changes would be there in the behavioral observation part. We just need to look out for them and provide them the kind of support that the child requires based on their need.
Interesting. Psychological first aid. My next question is, and of course anybody can answer here, do you think teachers are equipped to make that kind of an observation and behavioral change?
Just taking off from what Mimamsa said, yes, one of the things that has happened to a lot of students is that they've become fearful because they've been through a very, very traumatic time. I live in a society, 2 buildings away, my friend, she lives over there. She lost her father-in-law in the initial stages of the lockdown. Now, normally what happens is that neighbors step up and, they keep the children away so that they're spared the, traumatic sites of the last rites and all. But because of COVID, there was also the protocols that needed to be followed. And at that time, the only thing that we knew was that it was very contagious. And so even the neighbors were very fearful of taking the children into their houses, lest they too become infected. So this young boy, Rishabh, he saw his grandfather pass away. And within a week of that, he started getting nightmares. His biggest fear, after a lot of discussion, my neighbor told me, was he was afraid that his parents would both die and he would be left alone. And as you correctly asked, I don't think teachers have the wherewithal to be able to deal with it, because we must understand that they also have a task to do. They've come back to school, they're going to take examinations. So they're already burdened with that. And while as a teacher, I know that I try to be very mindful in a classroom, it is difficult to expect teachers to be able to identify or even step up and take remedial action for that. I think, schools need to now really replan and rethink how they need to have regular counseling sessions for students who show behavior which is a little different from what students used to behave prior to the pandemic.
Absolutely. I think this aspect of counseling and a moral holistic development is something I think modern education, including the best of schools, have given a miss. What do you think, Srinivasan?
Actually, the schools that have evolved in the last decade or so, far better placed than schools that were
the very schoolmaster type.
So the schools that have come up, but their numbers are very, very small. Because there the outlook is, you're not a teacher. Every child in your class, 25 or 30, whatever it is, they're as good as your children. 24/7 access, you are accessible. So there are a lot of things that are there in the new age schools that have come up. Their outlook is also very different. But the challenges are the schools which are traditional, which have been existing over the last years, where kind of schools prevailed in from 80s to 2000, 2005, 2010. Those kind of schools where the teachers, it is about a job, it is being a job. And predominantly, the children from those kind of schools would suffer. Because I've seen the schools that have emerged in the last 10, 15 years. Perhaps children from these schools are better, they cope better because the teachers are mentors, facilitators that go beyond the school hours. The children from such schools have been able to handle it better. That's what I feel.
Okay. While we are about how schools handled these situations, let's go over and we've got with us a bite from Shukota D'Souza, who is an education director in a renowned school in Kolkata.
During the pandemic, social distancing and isolation was a concern for most of the parents for the mental health of their children, like anxiety, loneliness, depression, and withdrawal among their children. I had advised the parents to speak to the children regularly and make them express their negative feelings, even allow them to do video calls to their friends and speak to them. And of course, physical exercises at home is a must. Meditation really helps to calm their minds. I had even told the parents to encourage them to see TV, listen to music, or find out a hobby which brings them joy.
Very few parents were actually equipped to deal with this situation. While it was traumatic for the students to remain confined to the home, it was quite unsettling for the dad and sometimes a working father and mother, even when there was physical space. The fact that you were jostling and bumping into each other 24 hours a day, as they say, there must be distances in togetherness as well. So what do you think?
Well, I think, like I said, each one of us had our own challenges. And I think in that sense, we really need to give it to ourselves, whether it is parents, whether it is teachers, whether it's schools. I think in some form or the other, we all have been frontline workers. Impact is always going to be there. For any situation which is uncertain, unprepared, unprecedented, and mammoth of what we'd faced, impact is going to be there. But we also have to look at and value the fact how much and what all we could do with the limitations that we had. And that back to ourselves is something which is important, because that brings hope, that brings optimism in us and in the lives of people around us as well. So yes, parents struggled, teachers struggled too, multiple roles, multiple responsibilities, too many things that happened, and yet we all have sailed through those challenges, and we are back now, back in the physical space.
And I wonder sometimes, today we think of parents as buddies and parents as friends, and we're a much more friendlier family than we used to be maybe 30 years ago. And where there was more hierarchy within the family, there were more distances between the father and the son or the daughter. Had this struck us 30 years ago, I wonder what would have happened actually.
Unable to cope with this, one way what we did in our society was we formed support groups, where young mothers with children, were members. And of course, none of us had the wherewithal or the, technical training to be able to guide, in inverted commas, anybody. But speaking from our life experiences, just putting it out there, hearing somebody else who had been going through the same thing, drawing upon your own life experiences to give whatever little help or support that you could emotionally, whatever ways they could, to cope with it. And coming back to what began with, resilience, I think, is one thing. If we can, say something about the pandemic.
If you may add quickly a couple of points. This also enabled in many of those connected homes, the parents who never had peep into the classroom of children, though it has got a downside to it, but a lot of parents could really relish, and that also enabled a big cohorts of parents of same classroom children, and they worked. In many schools I saw, they worked in a very cohesive and collaborative manner to enable children. I never seen in my life the way it happened in those connected households where parents, at least one parent is free, and the parents got together, the WhatsApp groups flourished, and you suddenly realize a lot of collaborative work started happening, very interestingly.
And here's Sonali Sen, the principal of a very reputed school from Newtown, Kolkata.
The last 2 years of lockdown has played havoc in our lives. Staying at home for days on end took a toll. They had to cope with a lot of issues. Not being able to interact and share made many of them withdrawn. Many of them faced the loss of near and dear ones to COVID. Running around in the middle of the night for a hospital bed or oxygen support made them grow up overnight. Even now, they feel burdened and confused, not understanding the reason as to why it had to happen. Parents also faced financial loss, and the effect trickled down to the children. Their health took a beating. Excessive screen time put a strain on their eyes. Lack of movement and physical exercises has made many of them overweight. Though academics continued online, there are huge learning gaps. Quite a few children need help to get back to writing.
Yes, and I think a very valid point that you made there. For a 13-year-old who has seen somebody pass away all of a sudden, and the traumatic experience of trying to cope with that situation. However, as we draw to the conclusion of the program, my question is, COVID is not probably the last pandemic we have seen. Are we prepared, our homes, our schools, having gone through this, prepared to cope with such an exigency better the next time around, God forbid it strikes?
Yes, I think, this has indeed been an eye-opener for the schools, and hybrid learning is here to stay. Earlier, we did have some schools which were in remote areas trying to do this. But today, even in the bustling metropolis, that is Delhi, hybrid learning has to be a part of the educational transaction. And I think a lot of schools have realized this and are now going to take a very hard, long look at how to make this a part of their regular transaction as time goes by.
Mamanta, your thoughts on that?
I would begin by saying that we have to look at pros and cons of both the things. So of course, there is no replacement for physical learning. Digital learning has been a boon during this time period. And of course, digital as a medium is here to stay. So we're going to use digital interface for various things. We've been using it for information, a lot more for learning in the last 2 years. It will continue to be like that. For different age groups, for different people, different use, all of those aspects. What we really need to look at, and what everyone, all those clips that we had heard, is connectivity. I think at the deep core level, everyone was saying how disconnected we felt because there was physical distancing. And that does bring us to the fact that how much relationships, support systems within the community, within homes, within any relationship that you have is so much more valuable to us that we really need to work towards building that connectivity and keep going on that, because for everyone that holds the core and that gives us the resilience. That gives us the hope that don't worry, even if you are in that bad space, I am there for you. So be there. And that's one of the key elements of psychological first aid. Something very simple that each one of us can learn. One is just look if anybody around you requires support. Second, just listen to them by being there. You don't have to advise, you don't have to do anything. And third, just link them to wherever support and service you think they're going to get beyond your listening as a support. So I think for each one of us, that has been a learning. We all need to prep ourselves for this. If there is anything else that comes up, how can each individual provide that psychological support to each and everyone around us?
Brilliant. I think that's where we need to go. We cannot wish away unfortunate catastrophes like COVID. They will probably crop up, God knows when. But I think this is a lesson for posterity. The way we have coped with it, our failures and our successes, are a lesson for posterity. And I think those who are kids today, for whom it just passed by like that, the 5-year-olds and the 6-year-olds, we should start, as they grow up, start sharing our experiences of what we did to cope with a situation like this.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
I did a small thing with my 8-year-old, is that I created a memory capsule. And we've just kept it somewhere. She's written a letter to her 14-year-old during this 2 years, what she did and what all simple things that she did.
Wow, that's
fantastic.
And we've just put it somewhere in our house that after a couple of years, although after a couple of months, she still remembers, where did you keep it? And I said, no, we're going to open, just give yourself maybe a year or two more. And then we're going to open it. So because these stories of inspiration needs to continue. And a lot of stories of inspiration and hope are going to come up from this time. So I think that's the legacy we need to take forward.
I think that's a wonderful, experiment that you've carried on, because human nature is such that it does tend to forget the bad times, But what we need to remember is not the bad times, but how we coped to build a better tomorrow.
We began the program by talking about its title, Withering Smiles. And I think as we draw to a conclusion, I might as well say that hopefully we have left our listeners on the way to thinking how to smile through and live through difficult times, how to be wiser, more courageous, and live through it, maybe with a smile. Thank you all of us for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
You were listening to a panel discussion entitled Withering Smiles. The panelists were Ms.Sapna Bhatia, leading education consultant, Ms. Mimamsa Singh Tanwar, well-known clinical psychologist, Mr. R. Srinivasan, co-founder and chief customer officer of one of Asia's leading education service providers, and Anandu Chakravarti, media personality, who initiated and moderated the discussion. Produced and presented by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio Delhi, this program came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.